My dear students, you are welcome to my class, and I'm presenting before you this lesson entitled True Nature of the Science of Education. You see, the main object of this lesson is to discuss minutely the true nature of the science of education as a disciplinary science. So, well, friends, while discussing the nature of education, two specific problem issues are always encountered, and these include the science and the exact use of the words, and the second, education, whether defining the term is difficult or not. So let me start with the first one, science and exact use of the words. Anyone who claims to be dealing with scientific issues has to be able to show that he or she knows what exactly is included in his or her field of study. So therefore, one has to be able to describe with few words the essential features of the scientific field of study. In other words, those features have to be defined as clearly as possible, and this principle is the trademark of all the branches of the scientific study, including the science of education. Now, let me proceed to the another issue, education uh, difficult to define. Well, the main purpose of formulating definitions is to make the meaning of keywords as explicit as possible. Open and undistorted communication is an essential element of scientific research, and careful definition of the used terminology, that is, the description of the way the words are used, is a means to this end. Another important thing associated with the discussion on the nature of education is nothing but the problem of terminology. Well, apparently, the ideal model of scientific concept has been taken from natural sciences like physics or chemistry. They offer the criteria for scientific inquiry. And this can be seen quite clearly if one looks at the field of knowledge produced by educational research. And as such, it doesn't belong to the family of so-called true sciences. Otherwise, it won't be necessary to use euphemism like educational studies instead of science of education. So there seems to be good reasons for such mixed modesty, and the idol of exact terminology has turned out to be difficult to achieve within the science of education. So this is caused by the ambivalent nature of the very word education. It has turned out to be difficult, if not impossible, to define. Dear students, can we find any ways and means to scale down these problems persistent while dealing with the nature of education? Yes, some researchers even assert that education belongs to so-called essentially constructed concepts. That is, there is no undisputable way of formulating a definition of education. If this were true, the very basis of the autonomy of the science of education would collapse. Therefore, it is worthwhile trying to save the scientific nature of the education research. I tell you, there are some three specific facts are associated with this. The first one is that the concept of education is not difficult to define, provided that one notices the word education always involves a hidden normative meaning. Second, uh, the definition of education cannot include any specific normative meanings. The concept of education has nothing to do with objective or absolute values. Uh, third and last fake associated is that the normative nature of the word education or the normative basis for using that word is to be taken into consideration when one is delineating the purpose of the science of education. So, students, let me tell you something about the narrow range of education. As long as education is understood to mean activities taking place in school or school-like institutions, the range of educational studies is reduced far too narrow. We can demarcate the meaning of education or the field of study of the science of education as a process word. And one implication of this is that it can be used in multiple contexts. When the science of education is concerned, the core meaning of the word is something like developing further, making to grow. Dear students, I may be wrong. I think it is the right time and right situation to discuss some new definitions of education. Uh, uh, First of all, Michael Knight in the year 1984 argues that education is a legitimizing word. The teaching of a particular subject or range of topics may be the more legitimated, the more widely it is believed to fall under the term that is education. So this is exactly what I mean with the manifesto-like character of the word education. It is not just a name, it is an ultimately concentrated pitch of information. Actually, the same idea can be found in Frank Anna uh, when she writes in 1973 that education must foster disposition and use methods that are desirable and morally unobjectionable, or at least regarded as such, otherwise it is not education, emphasis mine. Obviously, this notion should lead to a conclusion that the characteristics of the phenomenon of education have to be sought from the name-giving process and not from the things that are named as education. Frangina in 1973 further writes that Plato, Kant, Dewey, outsiders all mean by education or its equivalents in their languages the same thing, that is a process involving an educator and an educated of forming desirable dispositions by desirable methods, that is emphasis mind. Interestingly, is published in volume number 4 of the 15th edition in the New Encyclopedia Britannica. The term education is defined as a discipline that is concerned mainly with methods of teaching and learning in schools or school-like environments as opposed to various informal means of socialization. The connection to schooling is obvious. And surprisingly, the following definition has been given by UNESCO. Education is the organized and sustained instruction designed to communicate a combination of knowledge, skills, and understanding valuable for all activities of life. So, friends, based on the UNESCO definition of education discussed just in the last slide, the field of the study of the science of education can be presented in the form of key questions. So it was not selected because it is better than others, but because it is as good as others. According to the UNESCO definition, the elementary questions for science on education would be presented in terms of four different questions. The first one is how the education is organized and sustained, and who is the organizer. Second, how the education is communicated. Third, what kind of knowledge, skills, and understanding are regarded to be valuable? Why? Fourth, what kind of activities life includes? Now, we have come to the limits of this kind of definition, and the focus is on the objects that are called as education. But this is not enough for the critical study of educational activities. The way of using the word education should be the most important issue for the science of education. Therefore, the list needs an additional question, that is, by what right something is called education. Who has the right or privilege to define what is valuable? Yes, friends. What could be the workable concept of education in this globalized world? So let me tell you, in these days, the key concept of the science of education, the correct use of the word education cannot be simply based on institutions or objective values, right? This is valid in static or demagogic societies. But in democracy, the correct use of the word education should be based on the intersubjective meaning giving process. And the main task of the science of education, the reason why it has its autonomy, is to keep this process going on. So there is no other branch of scientific study that would or could do this except education. So now, dear students, let us start discussing the specific nature of education, in a systematic way. As you know, as you are aware, education is a comprehensive term and it reflects one's day-to-day life and an essential aspect for perfect balanced personality development. On the other hand, the meaning of education can be understood from the narrower as well as broader point of view. Education, in the narrower sense, means conscious and deliberate process, modifies the behavior of the learner and brings about in the education specific knowledge and skills. Such an education is confined to school and the university instructions, whatever takes place in school and whatever influence the child behavior is considered education. But in broader point of view, education is a lifelong process. It starts with conception and ends with that what we favorably call womb to tomb process. It is a preparation of life through life experiences. Here, education is not limited in classroom teaching or training, and uh, following are some of the characteristics of education as a discipline. Well, uh, one of the most important character or nature of education is that education is purposive. Every individual has some goal in his life. Education contributes in the attainment of the goal, and there is a definite purpose to underline all educational activities. Human behavior is modified and improved through educational process. Second nature or the characteristics of education is that education is deliberate. It involves special care and guidance. The process of education is not any conscious but also deliberate. The educator is fully aware of the fact that his aim is to develop the personality of the child along the definite line through the modification of his behavior. Third important nature of education is that education is drawing out and bringing up process. Yes, different meaning of education highlighted that education is the process of bringing out the innate potentialities of the child. Education is an active and dynamic process by which modifications are brought about in the behavior of an individual. Fourthly, education is knowledge as well as experience. Education is not only simply acquiring different types of knowledge, but it involves real life experiences. Human progress through ages has been made possible through the increase and diffusion knowledge. Again, education is liberal and vocational. Let me explain it. Education can be considered as a liberal process and later it will help the child to train in a particular vocation. Education is meaningful only when it aims at some employment. Modern democratic education has placed vocational aim is its forefront. Yes, education is again for the good of the individual and the welfare of the society. Please listen carefully. The purpose of education is well-being of the individual and the welfare of the society, and hence it is a synthesis of the individual and society. Education is called a force for social development which brings improvement in every aspect of the society. Education is again is stabilizer, conservator, and reconstructionist. Education helps to conserve, stabilize, and reform the society and culture. Mind you, education is planned, education is not half-hedged. Education itself is a plan and systematic. It refers to transact its activities through a systematic institution and regulation. Again, education is lifelong. Education starts from the time of conception inside the womb of mother and goes until death. Education from cradle to grave is sometimes said. Education is lifelong process because every stage of life of an individual is important from the educational point of view. Hence, education is a continuous and a lifelong process. It is the process of development from infancy to maturity. It includes the effect of everything which influences human personality. Again, education is influence exerted. Education is a mature persons, both teachers, parents, and adult influence on child. Yes, education is a balanced development. Education is concerned with the development of all faculties of the child. It performs the functions of the physical, mental, aesthetic, moral, economic, spiritual development of the individual so that the individual may get rid of his animal instincts by sublimating the same so that he becomes a civilized person. According to Adams, education is again a bipolar process in which one personality acts on another to modify the development of another person. But teacher and the pupil influence each other and thus the personality of the educand got modified. The behavior of the educand and in turn is affected by the personality of the educator and the process is not only conscious but it is very deliberate I should say if I have not mistaken. And education is again a tripolar process, or it is a three-dimensional process. John Dewey has rightly remarked all education is processed by participation of the individual in the social consciousness of the race. Thus, it is a society which will determine the aims, the contents, and the methods of teaching. In this way, the process of education consists of three different poles. The teacher is the first pole, the child is the second, and the society is the third pole. Again, education is psychological as well as social. The endowments or the capacities of the child, his needs, his interests, etc. All these things must be interpreted and developed in a social settings. Uh, Another significant characteristics or nature of education is nothing but education is growth. The aim of growth is more growth, and the aim of education is more education. So, according to John Dewey, an individual is a changing and growing personality. The purpose of education is to facilitate the process of his or her growth. Education modifies the behavior of the child, and human behavior is modified and improved through educational process. And again, education is a training. Human senses, human mind, human behavior, human activities, human skills, all these things are trained in a constructive and socially desirable way. Education is again considered as instruction and direction. It directs and instructs an individual to fill his desires and needs for exaltation of his whole personality. Education is life again. Without education, life is meaningless, and it is something like the life of a beach. Every aspect of the incident needs education for its sound development. Mind you, education is continuous reconstruction of our experience. As per the definition of John Dewey, education reconstructs and remodels our experiences towards socially desirable way. And again, education helps in individual adjustment. A man is a social being. If he is not able to adjust himself in different aspects of his life, his personality cannot remain balanced. Through the medium of education, he learns to adjust himself with the friends, with class fellows, with parents, with relatives, neighbors, teachers, and so on. Again, education is purely a dynamic process. Education is not a static but a dynamic process which develops the child according to changing situations and times. It always induces the individual towards progress. It reconstructs the society according to the changing needs of the time and the place of the society. Education is, last but not the least, power. Education is power, and the treasure in human being through which he is entitled is a supreme master on earth. Education is a lifelong process. So, my dear teacher tradies, to conclude, uh, the role of education is countless for a perfect society and man. Hence, it is necessary for every society and a nation to bring holistic education for happiness and prosperity to its individuals. So, therefore, efforts must be given to explore nature of education as a discipline in two steps. First, to find a suitable place for it in the disciplinary classification system, and second, to explore its unique features which set it apart from other disciplines. So, with this, let me say thank you for watching and listening to the lesson. So, thank you once again.